Well, that probably doesn't fit for you.
Also remember, press the button on the microphone if you have a question to ask.
Oh, okay.
All right, we are
Let me
recording.
go a little bit. Yes.
All right, ready to record.
Welcome to Security Seminar at Purdue University. It's our pleasure to have Ms. Jill Frisbee as our guest speaker today. Jill is a manager in the risk consulting practice with Crowley Chiswick and Company. Her specialties are in the area of information security and data privacy. She had an extensive experience in helping major companies and government organizations in safeguarding computer information. Outcomes of Jill's research and her methodologies have appeared in accounting and finance-related publications. And we are here today for a talk on protecting data privacy, a practical guide to managing risk. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jill Frisbee.
Thank you. Like I was introduced, my name is Jill Frisbee, and I'm a manager with Crowe Chiswick. For those of you who aren't familiar with Crowe, it's the 8th largest consulting and accounting firm in the country, and one of our specialties is information security. We help companies with all facets of information security, from ethical hacking to consulting projects, etc. And one of the projects that's been in high demand lately has been data privacy. Companies need to understand what they have, where they have it, and how to protect it. And so we've been doing a lot of research and discussions on protecting data, identifying data, etc. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is how to make data privacy practical. So everybody knows, if you think of a company, they have data everywhere. They use it for a variety of different purposes, and it becomes a very overwhelming task. Corporate America and corporate executives are really challenged with the prospect of protecting the data that they use and transmit. And so today, we're going to talk about how we help companies make that practical. So we're going to talk about the goal of some of the exercises that we do with companies and the goal of data privacy programs. We'll look at the current landscape of data privacy and discuss some of the different events in the past few years that have shaped the current landscape of data privacy. We'll be looking at common program pitfalls, so common things that cause issues as companies try to implement a data privacy program. We'll be looking at successful data privacy tips, so the types of things that successful companies do to protect private data. One of our approaches is the top-down privacy risk assessment, starting with the top of a company and working down through its various organizational units, and we'll be talking about that more today, as well as the roles and responsibilities in that top-down organization from executive management on down for data privacy. And then we'll be looking at the results of a risk assessment and the future steps for a data privacy program. So when companies come to us with data privacy problems, they've usually got a newspaper article in their hand of one of their competitors or somebody in their local market that's lost data. They've lost a laptop. They've lost a backup tape. Something has happened, and this corporate executive is worried. They don't know how it could impact them. They don't necessarily know what they want to do about it. They just want to know they don't want to be that company on the front page of the paper. We also deal with companies who are on the front page of the paper who unfortunately have had a data breach, have had to notify customers, and suddenly their board of directors, their shareholders are saying, do something about it. I don't know what to do, but you got to do something about this. We've got to figure out some way to better protect our data. And so companies come to us and say, how do we prevent this disclosure? Help us understand what the law requires us to do. Help us do something that's practical yet effective, keeps us out of the papers. They all want to do a risk assessment. They use this buzzword, we want to do a risk assessment to understand our data privacy risks. So they want to understand what they have and where they hold it, and then how they protect it. And we'll talk more about that today. they have a feeling that their staff doesn't understand data privacy, or that they don't understand data privacy, so they understand that they've got to protect data. They understand that they have sensitive data, but there's a gap there. And so they want to understand, how do we educate our organization on data privacy? They want to implement controls that are reasonable. So they don't want to see a downturn in business because of new systems or controls that they've had to implement. And then they want to mitigate the risks that we've talked about. Risks to their reputation, risks from their examiners, regulators, and the government, risks to litigation and lawsuit, and then financial risks, the costs of putting people on credit monitoring services, as well as the costs of sending a letter to 100,000 customers. This timeline just gives a high-level overview of kind of where we've come from. In 1995, we started to see a surge in identity theft. We started to see a surge in crimes related to impersonation of identity by improper disclosure of information. And from there, we started to see the different industry groups, the different government agencies spur up their requirements on protection of data. So we identified in the late 90s that this is a problem. People's information is being disclosed inappropriately, and it's leading to quite a bit of financial loss in the country for consumer fraud and other events. So we started to see increased visibility and awareness, rules like HIPAA, California Civil Code 1798, and GLBA. Then we started to see the first major breaches announced publicly. What I always say is, in the early 2000s, this was not the first time somebody lost a backup tape. In the history of computing, certainly someone before has lost a backup tape, or the Postal Service has lost a package with sensitive computer disks. But we started to see these events making the news. People became more aware of data breaches and what it means to lose a laptop, to lose a computer, to lose a tape, or to lose paper-based data. And then we started seeing increasing in state laws. So California led the way with state laws on pressures to notify. We started to see more states follow suit. Other agencies release similar standards. And now in 2007, almost daily we have a company that reports a breach of some kind. And because of that, we've seen a strong increase in the pressure for good federal legislation in the United States to universally protect the privacy of data. These are some examples that you may have heard about in the news, some of the famous examples of incidents that were turning points in data privacy. The Bank of America backup tape for the banking industry was really one of the events that made sparked an industry change in the protection of private data for the financial sector. And that's because after the Bank of America backup tape and the handling of the backup tape lost by Bank of America, the government regulators decided that all banks would have to disclose breaches in a timely fashion and have more robust incident response programs to handle those breaches. The Veterans Administration is a very widely publicized case of a government agency which seemingly had insufficient controls over its data about its veterans and presumably private citizens. You can see some other examples there. PrivacyRights.org is a great site. They keep a running list of any company that loses data, the magnitude, related articles. So I would encourage you to visit that site to get more information about recent data breaches. There are quite a few. So the landscape today. Customer notification is key. Ever since the 30 some odd state laws, the federal laws in certain industries like banking, we've seen incidents of customer breach the papers. And so the strongest push today is to keep your name out of the papers. The types of things that can keep you away from high-profile reputational damage. The Ponemon Institute did a study last fall of exactly how much it costs a company when they lose this data, and you can see the breakout here. They average $182 per customer record. If you're a company, even a small-sized company that has 10,000 consumer clients, or on up for the largest companies in the United States, you can see how this multiplies. Okay, so we've identified that this is a problem. Companies have identified this as an area where they want to improve their controls. They've identified that they want to be good corporate citizens in protecting data, and so they go out and they decide, okay, let's get a group together, let's let's do a data privacy program. I don't know what that means. Maybe they've got somebody with some expertise in computers or computer security. They bring together a group and they say, we're going to do a data privacy program. And so hopefully they bring in experts like our firm or other consultants to help, or they have somebody on staff that's got appropriate expertise in information security. Oftentimes we come in after the fact and we see situations where someone has attempted a privacy program and it just hasn't worked. And so I wanted to review with you some of the common pitfalls that we see as we work with our clients that have attempted data privacy programs or have started down the path of a data privacy program. The first pitfall that we see is the hands-off approach. And with the hands-off approach, they've gone online, they've gotten some sort of a risk assessment template or survey. Perhaps they've bought a tool. In some cases, there are some automated tools that have web surveys for data privacy. And they've sent this out. Maybe they sent it to all employees or all managers, and they've sent out, tell us how you use this information. And they've developed some sort of a scoring system that, based on their responses, it will automatically tell them what to do and how to fix all of the problems of the world. And the problem is it removes the involvement of an information security professional to really discern perception versus reality, to really discern what truly is a data privacy problem and what isn't. And so what we find is companies that try these survey approaches and use that and only that as a method of understanding their data privacy risks commonly end up with spreadsheets and data that they can't use and that's not effective because it's not accurate in a lot of cases. And I think that the intent is not to burden people with a lot of meetings or interviews with the information security team. The intent is good, but the result is that departments get more frustrated because when automated results get back, automated suggestions on how to improve data privacy, you end up with departments that are more frustrated because that may not be realistic, or it may not truly help protect their needs given their business drivers. The second pitfall we see is people that go with what I call the inventory of grains of sand at the beach. Every few months we have a company that calls us and says, okay, we've got a data privacy problem, and here's what I know. I have 100 databases. Each database has 1,000 attributes, so just figure out which ones of those are private, we'll encrypt those, and we'll call it a day. And the problem with that approach is, first of all, you're way down at the minutia detail right away. And so you're sifting through data. You don't necessarily know what the purpose is of that data, whether or not it's necessary data or data that can be truncated. You don't know the use of that data and the access management controls around that data. And so you kind of get lost in the details and you end up with some analysis on data that may or may not help you, in the end, implement practical solutions to protect that data. So certainly there are great tools out there that will scan for private data that we recommend that you use at the end of your project to validate the information that you've gotten. But starting down in the minutia details can often be a frustrating exercise. And the fact of the matter is most of the breaches that you hear about, most of the breaches that have been publicly reported, are not because a database didn't have certain fields encrypted. They're usually a bigger problem and possibly a bigger solution. The next common issues that we see with privacy programs is that they fail to translate questions to an objective level. It would be the equivalent of coming in and saying, so going to a company, a department, and saying, do you have sensitive data and do you well protect it, is the equivalent of asking somebody if they're tall, short, somewhat short. It's not quantifiable. And so what you want to do is, whenever possible, when doing initial phases of data privacy investigation, you want to try to determine objective results on where data is, how it's classified, what its volumes is, and what it's used for. And so we always try to keep questions to departments or to people that are not information security professionals objective, so that you can get objective answers that are comparable from one department or one group to another. The other thing we find is bias. So what we find is if I go and I ask you, is the information in your backpack public or sensitive or highly sensitive? Everyone feels that the information about them or the information about their department is very sensitive. People are protective about their own data. And so instead, you need to bias yourselves towards a data classification scheme which sets parameters on what is sensitive, what is confidential, etc. as you've laid out. And so inevitably, if you ask somebody, their data is always very sensitive and it's always very well protected. So if I ask you, how well do you control your own personal information? I think everyone would say, I do a good job. I shred things. But if you don't ask objective questions like, tell me about how you use email and whether or not you email your own private information, which is, as you all know, is not a secure way to transmit information. Without asking those objective questions, you're not really going to get to the core of the risks that you may have from a data privacy perspective. Okay, so these are some of the key attributes of a successful data privacy program. First of all, it's aligned with the organization's strategic objectives. So we always try to tie it back to what the business is trying to do. So if you are a credit card company, your reputation is key. People have a lot of choices when they pick a credit card, but they want to pick you because you're the most trusted and because they feel like they'll have the least incident of fraud, etc. with your card. And so we always want to tie privacy programs or information security projects of any type back to the company's strategic objectives. Data privacy programs is an organization-wide problem. It's not an IT problem. It's not a compliance department problem. It's an organization-wide problem. And so for that reason, it's got to have the full and visible support of the upper management of a company. It starts at the top and it goes all the way down. You have to have buy-in for a data privacy program across the organization. It's not sufficient that just the managers know what's going on, they know the plan. You need everybody in the corporation or the government agency or the university to understand what the objectives are of the data privacy program and what their role. So you're going to have specific targeted education, specific targeted documentation for every level of your organization, but it's an organization-wide effort. Anyone who's involved in the handling, transmittal, etc. of customer data needs to be involved in the program. It's got to be championed with people with sufficient expertise. And so, my job is to come in and help companies provide that expertise if they don't already have it in-house. But companies have to either have in-house or outside consultant help from people that are experts in information security so that they don't miss data privacy pitfalls and threats that might not be as obvious to them initially. We talked about communication to all employees, and it has to be tested for effectiveness. So you can write a great program, you can create a great policy, but if you're not testing to see if it's effective, you haven't really mitigated your risk fully. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the top-down approach. So I was saying that it starts at the top of an organization and it filters down to every employee in the organization. So this is an example of an organizational chart and how we walk through the process of a data privacy project. So it starts at the very top, Acme University. And let's say Acme University has 3 different departments. The initial steps in the data privacy project are as easy as saying, all right, what do these departments do? Do they have any interaction with private data, whether that be consumer data or sensitive research that's not public, etc.? So we would go through and say, where is our pertinency, the protection of data privacy? And right off the bat, we're going to focus on certain departments and certain processes that are more sensitive, and some that maybe we don't need to waste our time on because they clearly have no impact on consumer data. Once we identify a process, something that a company is doing, for the purposes of this example, we'll take consumer marketing. So the process by which a company analyzes its current customers and its prospects and sends out marketing materials, does campaigns, places advertisements, etc. So in this case, that's our process A2. There's going to be a number of different what we call information assets associated with that process. In order to market to consumers, you're going to have applications that create mailers. You're going to have databases that contain your information that you can parse for this kind of data. You presumably may print some of those at any given time. You might have paper. You may have third parties that you work with, so companies that actually do the printing or companies that help you develop campaigns. You may have reports that you run out of these systems, like your top 100 customers, etc. And so what we look at is we look to build a matrix of information assets. So we say, where's the data and what type of data do you have? A lot of times one of the pitfalls of programs that we see otherwise is they focus just on the computer systems. And that might be the focus for your initial phase of the project. But really protecting data privacy involves looking at all of the different forms in which data might hold. I mean, we've seen some of the most public cases have been on tapes and disks and laptops with files, etc., not on the primary source of the data itself. We take a three-step approach to data gathering when we go through this process. The first is identification of the departments and processes like we talked about. What's applicable, what's not. And during that phase, during those interviews, you can kind of gauge, all right, where should we be really focusing our time? Maybe we include some departments in the later discussions. But we're not going to focus a lot of time and effort there because that's not their, it doesn't drive their business. Sensitive information doesn't drive their business. The second step is the inventory. Once we've identified the groups, departments, processes that are in scope, then we say, all right, let's create an inventory. The inventory is always rough at first. You send out some questionnaires that say, create a list for me. Walk around, inventory paper for me. Discuss with your department in your next meeting where all you have electronic files that may contain sensitive information. And it's always rough at first, and you always will refine it as the process continues. But having a good holistic department list is important. One of the things we stress with people is that, if Jane Smith is responsible for Department A, she's responsible for all of Department A. She's responsible for talking to people, for inquiring with IT that may support Department A, truly understanding, all right, what are all the different information assets that we have? And then Jane may play a continual role in updating that inventory, or if she becomes aware of an additional asset, of adding that to the inventory and risk assessment process. So during that inventory, once we identify what we have, we've got this master list of what we have, then we try to classify it in some way. And companies that have strong data privacy programs develop some sort of a data classification scheme. So that could either be based on a number scheme, sensitive data 1 through 5. Some people use colors, words. There's no sort of standard. It's whatever is going to fit your corporate culture and be interpreted the best. And this is because companies have different, the term confidential at one company to another is going to be interpreted very differently. So you want to have a scheme that's going to align that, because a large number of people are going to be asked to align data with that scheme, and so you want to have something that's easily interpreted and understood. Once we identify what we have, where it is, and how sensitive it is, then we have to measure it against a certain baseline set of controls. We have to identify what are the types of key things that we need to do to protect consumer data. Perhaps with mobile media, we need to encrypt it. With paper files, they need to be in locked containers or secured while in transit. With computer systems, we need to have strong passwords and access management, we have to have good patch management, etc. So we identify for each asset type, what are the different types of controls that are pertinent to that asset type. When we do this control analysis, we're going to have physical, operational, and technical controls. We run the full gamut of the different types of things that can protect that information. You see an example there of mobile media. Some of the example controls that we've used in the past of measurements that we've taken for mobile media. So if we do our inventory of mobile media and we determine that we have 100 different types of mobile media across our organization, then we're going to benchmark each of them against these controls and say, all right, are the controls sufficient to protect the data for each of these categories? Okay, once we've gone through and we've done our controls analysis, we can truly begin to assess risk. We can assess where are our gaps. Where do we have discrepancies between what we think should be an appropriate control? For example, media is secured while it's in transit. Media is shredded, etc. Where is there a discrepancy between what we would expect and what we found? And that's where you start to get into risk mitigation plans, gap analysis, etc., where companies start to take action items, start to build a list of to-dos, so to speak, where they can say, all right, here are the different things we need to do to bring our current activities up to what we would expect to happen in our organization. We talked at the beginning of the presentation that everybody plays a role in information security. Everybody plays a role in data privacy, and so an important event that we have at the beginning of any of our projects is to explain the role of each player in a kickoff type meeting or in some sort of a forum where we can explain, hey, you have a role, you have a skin in this game. You know, keeping our name out of the paper is your job just as much as it is my job as an information security professional, because you own the data, you manage the data, you deal with it day to day. So the individual departments have a role to provide a comprehensive inventory of applicable information. So that may mean sitting down at a department meeting, that may mean doing some investigation, and we make sure it's clear to them that they're going to have to spend some time investigating, because truly an information security professional is not going to be able to understand every facet of a business, a department and what they do. They're going to have to rely upon the leaders of that business to do an inventory, to do investigation, to appropriately inventory where all private data sits. Accurately and timely about the controls in place, the type of data. So one of the things examples we always bring up with individual departments is, let's say that there's a file cabinet. In the file cabinet is very sensitive paper-based documents. And the file cabinet's got a lock on it, and the file cabinet has a key to it, and it's supposed to be locked at all times. But everybody knows that that key is in that cabinet and pretty much never gets taken out of the cabinet. That's pretty much where that key sits. And so, yes, technically the repository is locked, but the key sits in the file cabinet at all times. We ask them to report honestly and be upfront about controls that are working and controls that aren't working. Because that's a good opportunity as an information security professional for you to go back and say, all right, tell me why this isn't working. And they may say, well, we got one key and we've got 20 people that need to get in this at all hours of the day, and people leave and then they don't return their keys, and it's just causing too much of a problem. And at that point, as a security professional, you can recommend an alternative solution. Maybe you can integrate it into a key card system that you have for the building, or an alternative form of access. Maybe you can evaluate, all right, what is this paper really being used for? Do 20 people really need access to this, or might we be able to image this data and make it available online instead of in paper format? So as a security professional, we ask them to be upfront and honest, with no judgment on what we find. This is an initial risk assessment, and that allows us to come up with creative solutions of how to protect that data. In some cases, too, it's a matter of truncation. It's a matter of taking the data off the forms that would be harmful if it got into the wrong hands. So all of you, are information security experts, and so in helping companies and organizations protect data privacy, your role is really to establish the standard. What is the baseline against which we want to measure ourselves? You know that a tape that is unencrypted or the data is in plain text is a threat if it leaves the protected walls of an organization. And so you establish the standards that no magnetic media leaves these four walls without being encrypted. And then you work with individual departments to say, how can we make this work for you? Really, I think the key to success is that understanding, is making sure you keep in mind that people are just trying to do their job. They're using that data to further sales, to increase profits, etc. within the organization. And so really providing an atmosphere of support while you are critiquing practices is important. The risks of poor data safeguarding. A lot of our security officers do a good job of copying some of those articles out, emailing them to their companies and saying, all right, here's an article of a company that's lost data, and let me translate that to you, what it means to us and what we do to prevent the same kind of things from happening. So really, employee awareness programs that are robust are necessary for total participation in privacy programs. When you review objective data from the risk assessment, like we were saying, you're able to make educated subjective determinations of risk. So somebody reports back and they say, I have this application, it has this data in it, and these are the controls. As an information security professional, you're able to make more subjective decisions of whether or not you feel that's appropriate or not appropriate given data privacy risks. You can evaluate for an application, for example, whether or not it's an internet-facing application, an internal-facing application, and what are the risks associated with each, given the type of data, etc. And so you're asked to take objective data and make subjective analysis on that data. Okay, so the end result. And as I'm going through the end result, if you do have any questions, please jot them down, or we can even just have you jot your name down and we can ask questions in a few minutes. The end result of a successful data privacy program is you know where it is and what it is. You know in what formats that you store consumer data. You know what type of data it is. And then you know what controls are intended to protect that data. You know what should be happening. So let's say you do lose a backup tape. You know what controls are intended to protect you in that kind of situation. So you're able to better respond to incidents because you have anticipated that with an appropriate standards of controls to protect that data. Now, the one note that I make here is about control testing. So let's say that everybody knows that with this file cabinet that we were talking about earlier, that the key is permanently in the file cabinet. It doesn't get taken out at the end of the day, and that it's not really locked. Well, let's say the manager of that department says, yes, this file cabinet is locked at all times. This is an example of where we do follow-up testing and auditing. And a lot of times internal audit departments, consultants, or the information security department itself will perform what we call implementation testing or validation testing. Basically a test to say, all right, you said that this is your control, but is it really effective? Is it really effectively implemented in your organization? And that might be because the person filling out just doesn't know, or because maybe they wanted to paint their department a little more rosy than it actually is. And so following up on the controls, once you've had a department that says, yes, this cabinet's locked at all times, it's very easy then to walk through that department, maybe on an off hour and say, all right, are they living up to what they said that they were as far as their controls? So once we go through and we identify the gaps, we can compile what are our list of gaps and what are the threats because of those gaps. Once we identify, hey, here are all of the problems that we found during our risk assessment, we can say, so what? So that file cabinet's unlocked. What's the real impact? What's the impact on our business? What kind of loss might we exhibit? So we can prioritize for management. All right, here are the hot buttons. Here are the things we need to fix first and foremost because of this gap, we've got a pending threat where we could lose sensitive information. Again, identifying the practical solution is always the most important thing, whether that be truncation, whether that be, a control that may be slightly different than the standard. One of the things that a lot of companies will do with their information security policies is that they may have exceptions. So the standard may be that they encrypt all laptops, but they may have certain laptops where it's impractical to encrypt. And so they look at alternative solutions and just note those as exceptions to their data privacy program, allowed exceptions to their program. All right. So what we try to lay out for companies is what's the long-term plan. So you do this great assessment. We talked about getting senior management buy-in. We talked about doing the assessment. Once you have the assessment and you've agreed upon your controls that are important to you, that's when you start your long-term planning. What's my information security plan? What's my master document that's going to memorialize the appropriate controls for each type of information asset and for our environment as a whole? You establish an incident response plan. Of course, no one wants to have any sort of incident. No one wants to have any sort of situation where they lose data. But unfortunately, in most companies, Murphy's Law, there is a possibility that you would have an incident to lose data. So you know how you could respond quickly and promptly. One of the criticisms of Bank of America was that they didn't react fast enough. The examiners and the government agencies felt like they should have reacted faster, notified customers faster. And we see frequent occurrences in the news of companies that not only have lost data, but they're being criticized because there's a feeling that they held the fact that they lost data too long. They went too long without notifying consumers. We talked about testing. Some of the different types of testing that we perform on a regular basis are social engineering tests. So you do an employee awareness program, but does that really stop someone from giving out their password when you call and ask for it? Penetration testing is another way to make sure that applications, if you have a software vendor that claims that their web-based application is safe from a certain number of vulnerabilities, by doing an ethical hacking penetration test, you can test whether or not that's really the case. You can see the other tests there. Long term, you have to have a sustainable process for data privacy, and that involves having an owner, having someone in the organization that's responsible for data privacy long term, having ongoing awareness, like I said, those emails, or some people will do web-based training periodically, posters, inserts in employee newsletters, etc. Having that constant presence of data privacy throughout their organization. Periodically, you're going to have to go back and say, all right, is this still our list of information assets? Is there anything new that we've done? Is there a new business offering that we have that might impact data privacy? So you periodically have to go back and keep updated with your inventory of information assets and your understanding of how those information assets are controlled. And then based on that, you may need to make modifications to your information security program. So you may need to go back and say, all right, these controls no longer fit our environment. What can we do to tweak these and make these more strong, considering our new business line or considering our the changes in our corporate environment? Okay. So that's the long-term plan. Does anybody have any questions on data privacy or privacy concerns at companies, etc.? All right. Well, if there are no questions, I guess we'll conclude a little bit early. And appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
Anybody else? You?